Did you know there's a tree that literally grows bombs? Not metaphorically. Not in some loose, poetic sense where you're stretching the definition of the word to make something sound more dramatic than it is. Actual bombs. That actually explode. With enough force to seriously injure you if you're standing nearby when it happens. And before you assume this is some incredibly rare, incredibly remote thing that exists in one tiny corner of the world that normal people would never encounter. This tree grows in places people actually visit. Tourist destinations. Parks. Botanical gardens. Beaches in the Caribbean and Central and South America, where people go on holiday and walk around without any idea what they're standing next to. But here's the thing that makes the sandbox tree genuinely different from just being another dangerous plant. The explosion isn't even the first danger you'll face if you get close to one. It's not even the second. By the time you get to the part where the fruit starts exploding, you've already survived two separate things that could have seriously hurt you. And most people walking past one of these trees in the wild have no idea about any of it. So let's go in order. Because the sandbox tree is the kind of thing that keeps getting worse the more you look at it. First, let's say you're walking through a forest somewhere in Central America, or along a Caribbean coastline, or through a park in northern South America, and you come across this tree. It's a big tree, genuinely impressive in size. Sandbox trees can grow up to 30 meters tall, which puts them among the larger trees in the environments they grow in. The kind of tree that naturally draws your eye. The kind of tree that looks like it would be good to lean against for a rest, or put your hand on while you catch your breath on a trail. And then you get close enough to actually look at the trunk. And it's covered in spikes. Not small decorative thorns like you'd find on a rose bush. Not little bumps that are mildly uncomfortable to touch. Thick, hard, sharply pointed spikes covering the entire surface of the bark. Densely packed. Protruding out in every direction. The trunk of a sandbox tree looks less like a tree and more like something that was specifically designed to stop you from touching it. Which, in a sense, it was. Because that's exactly what those spikes are, a defense mechanism. An evolutionary solution to the problem of animals trying to climb or damage the tree. And they work. They work extremely well. Anyone who has accidentally walked into a sandbox tree trunk, or tried to lean against one without seeing the spikes, or attempted to climb one without knowing what they were dealing with, they felt it immediately. Deep puncture wounds from spikes that are hard enough and sharp enough to go right through clothing. Which is already a serious problem on its own. But it becomes a much bigger problem because of what comes next. The sap running through every part of the sandbox tree, the bark, the branches, the leaves, the roots, is a milky white sap. Now, if you've spent any time reading about dangerous plants, you might be noticing a pattern here. Because the milky white sap situation is something the sandbox tree shares with the manchineel tree we've covered before. But the sandbox tree's sap has its own particular profile of terrible. This sap is caustic. Deeply, seriously caustic. Skin contact causes immediate and painful irritation. Keep contact going and you get blistering. Severe blistering. The kind where the skin raises up into fluid-filled welts that take a long time to heal and are extremely painful throughout. If it gets in your eyes, and this can happen from touching the tree and then touching your face, or from sap dripping from above, it causes intense inflammation and in serious cases can cause blindness. Not temporary discomfort. Actual damage to your vision. And here's where the spike situation and the sap situation combine into something worse than either of them individually. Remember those spike wounds from touching the trunk? Open wounds. And now there's caustic sap on the surface of the tree that those spikes just punctured you with. The sap gets into the wounds. And if skin contact causes blistering, you can imagine what contact with an open wound causes. The pain is reported to be significantly worse. The sap essentially has a direct path through the skin's outer barrier and into the tissue underneath. So in the course of just approaching and briefly touching this tree, you've been punctured by spikes and had caustic sap introduced directly into those puncture wounds. And you still haven't encountered the thing the tree is actually famous for. But before we get there, let's just take a moment to appreciate how seriously indigenous peoples in Central and South America took this sap. Because they didn't just treat it as something to avoid. They used it as a weapon. Early indigenous hunters used sandbox tree sap on the tips of their arrows and blowgun darts. The sap made the wounds from those weapons significantly more damaging, introducing the caustic compound directly into whatever was struck. It was effective enough as a poison that it became a documented part of hunting and warfare in the regions where the tree grows. And it gets more extreme than that. There are accounts of hunters dropping sandbox tree sap directly into bodies of water to kill fish. The sap is toxic enough and disperses effectively enough in water that it could kill fish in a localized area, which would then float to the surface and be collected. A tree whose sap is caustic enough to blister skin, damage eyes, and poison water. Which is still not the worst part. So now let's talk about the fruit. The sandbox tree produces these seed capsules. And honestly, If you didn't know what they were, you might think they were kind of charming. They're small, round, segmented, a bit pumpkin-shaped. Hard wooden shells. They grow in clusters, and they have a neat, geometric quality to them that makes them look almost decorative, which is probably why people have historically picked them up without knowing what they were dealing with. Because what's happening inside that cute little pumpkin-shaped capsule, as it matures and ripens, is one of the most mechanically extraordinary things that happens in the plant world. As the fruit ripens, the outer shell starts to dry out, and as it dries, it contracts. The wooden shell pulls inward on itself, getting harder and more tense as the water content decreases. But the sections of the capsule, the individual segments, don't all dry at the same rate. And they're all connected to each other and to the central core. So as they dry and contract, they start pulling against each other, against the structure of the whole capsule, building tension. More drying, more tension, more pulling. The capsule is essentially becoming a spring-loaded mechanism, a structure under enormous mechanical stress that has nowhere to release that stress, yet. And the tension keeps building, until it can't anymore. And then the whole thing explodes. Not pops, not splits open, explodes. The force of the detonation, and that word is not an overstatement, is loud enough to be heard from a significant distance away. People who have witnessed sandbox tree explosions describe the sound as a sharp crack, like a gunshot. Loud enough to be genuinely startling if you're nearby. Loud enough that in forests where multiple sandbox trees grow, you can hear them going off in the distance. And when it goes, it doesn't just fall apart. The individual segments of the capsule become projectiles. They fly outward in every direction at speeds that have been measured at between 95 and 150 miles per hour. 150 miles per hour. For comparison, a baseball thrown by a professional pitcher reaches around 95 to 100 miles per hour, and those are considered dangerous enough that batters wear helmets and protective gear. The sandbox tree is launching wooden projectiles at speeds that exceed a professional fastball, in every direction simultaneously, from a mechanism that gives you no warning before it fires. And the seeds themselves, which are what all this explosive energy is designed to disperse, can travel up to 100 meters from the tree when the capsule detonates. 100 meters. The length of a football field, covered by a seed launched by a tree. This is the evolutionary strategy. The explosion is the dispersal mechanism. Instead of relying on animals to eat the fruit and carry the seeds elsewhere, or wind to carry lightweight seeds, the sandbox tree just builds up mechanical tension over time and then fires its seeds across the forest at highway speeds. It is one of the most dramatic seed dispersal systems in the natural world. And it works. The seeds land far enough from the parent tree that they're not competing for the same resources, and they land with enough force to partially embed themselves in the ground. Effective. Elegant in a violent kind of way. But absolutely terrifying if you happen to be standing near a sandbox tree when one of its fruit capsules decides it's had enough. Nature has produced a lot of dangerous things. Venomous animals. Toxic plants. Environments that can kill you in specific and dramatic ways. But there's something about the sandbox tree that feels different from most of them. Because most dangerous things in nature require some specific interaction to be harmful. Touch this. Eat that. Get bitten by this particular animal. The sandbox tree is dangerous at every stage, in multiple different ways, with the final danger being completely passive and completely unpredictable. You don't have to do anything wrong. You just have to be standing near it when the timer runs out.